Greetings, my fellow Americans, and welcome to another episode of the Great Montana Conspiracy Podcast. I'm your host, Ron Gregg. Tonight I'm actually going to be going a little bit backtrack. I've got to fix a problem I had with the last episode. I use a video camera to record my episodes. I have been for a little over a month now. Right around the time I got to the 3/4 mark, apparently the podcast recording actually stopped. Didn't realize that it stopped, and so I just kept continuing. Unfortunately, it ended up losing about 15 to 20 minutes of recorded material, which means the last podcast actually ended rather abruptly. It was deliberate, obviously. It was something I had next to no control over, but as a consequence, I have to now come back and talk about some of the issues that I left out. Or I was unable, not that I left out, but I was unable to cover in the last podcast. Now, it actually worked out pretty well because there was so much information to go over in the last podcast. I was actually concerned with it running like into a 2-3 hour range, so I actually cut out a lot of material trying to get it back so I could fit it within the relative range of an hour that I try to keep these podcasts within. But as a consequence of losing that 15 to 20 minutes, it actually does give me the ability to come back and actually fill in with more detail I otherwise would not have been able to just for time constraints. So I'm going to spend the first few minutes here going over material I've already gone over because it's going to kind of interrupt the flow if I just try to jump in directly where I left off. In case you didn't watch the last podcast and you're just jumping to this podcast, you do need to at least have a point where you're starting to make some sense. Now, I was talking about, of course, the Judicial Standards Commission and various different steps that we're going toward the efforts to reform it. And I was talking about, and when the video cut off, I was talking about Chief Justice Mike McGrath and when he was being interviewed by the legislature's subcommittee, which was known as Interim Law and Justice Committee. And in Montana, as a reminder, we have a citizens legislature that only meets for 3 months out of every 2 years, which means literally we have 3 months out of 24 months in which the legislature meets. If there's anything that needs to be done in the interim, they form committees to try to meet a couple of times in a year, try to gather information, try to organize things to prepare for the next legislative session. And that's what the Interim Law and Justice Committee is. It's designed to address the issues of the judicial reform in response to judicial lobbying that was discovered during the term of the 2021 state legislature. Now, Montana law actually prohibits justices from presiding over legislation that they previously commented on in public about, whatever. It actually, and the Constitution actually prohibits them from actually involving themselves in any other government's agency. And just to be clear, just so you know what I'm talking about here, the actual law at issue is known as NCA Section 3-1-610, and it reads, restrictions on judicial officers presiding over matters in which they have previously asserted position. This section applies to all judicial officers as defined by 1-1-202, which is the definition of what a judge is. Judicial officers may not participate in any action or proceeding involving the constitutionality of a provision of a bill if the judicial officer has appeared before the Montana legislature or otherwise contacted the legislature or other governmental entity in support or opposition of a bill involving the same legislation if it is at issue in a case in which a judicial officer presides. There's a couple other conditions there, but that's the one that's relatively important. If they have contacted the legislator, if they have contacted another government entity, either in support or opposition of a law, or a bill that's being proposed to be a law, they can't preside over it. What Mike McGrath was doing and his state court administrator and a handful of district court judges was they were polling every judge in the state, organizing to the Montana Judges Association to lobby against a couple of different bills that the Republicans in Montana legislature were actually trying to push through. Now, I have to say this, I should have said it in the last podcast, and need to make this statement. I myself am apolitical. I don't subscribe to Democratic politics, I don't subscribe to Republican politics. I personally think party politics should be outlawed. There needs to be too much divisiveness. There's obviously an exterior loyalty of these people that exists beyond the will of people for which they're supposed to represent. It's a huge calamity of politics and political power, and I don't agree with it. I don't side with Republicans universally, I don't side with Democrats universally. So the fact that I'm speaking about what the Republicans in the state legislature are doing is in no way endorsing the Republican Party, Republican politics, or Republican platform. I'm simply reporting that the Republicans in the state legislature were the ones who advanced these ideas. And by the way, I'm absolutely in support of everything they've done in this last legislative session. I'm not saying that, again, I'm not saying I'm a Republican, I'm not saying I'm not. I don't subscribe to politics at all, or political parties at all. So don't take the words I'm supporting their actions or supporting what they're doing in the form of judiciary reform be any kind of indication of an endorsement of a political platform or a political party. I'll argue for Democratic positions as often as I will do so with Republican positions. So please don't take my position here as being pro-Republican or anti-Republican or anti-Democrat or anything. This just happens to be me reporting what's going on in the state legislature. So, that being said, the issue before the trial, the reason why the Interim Law and Justice Committee was formed was because the legislature discovered in 2021 that the head justice of the Montana Supreme Court, Chief Justice Mike McGrath, his court administrator, and other judicial officials were discussing legislation through an email chain. And this email chain was being used primarily to lobby for and against legislation that influenced the judiciary. Or at least it wasn't the primary focus of this chain, but it encapsulated an issue within this chain. So they started talking about this and lobbying for and against it. It led ultimately to the Montana Justice Association and the Montana State Bar, which, by the way, is a division of the Montana Supreme Court in Montana. They are an integrated entity. They started lobbying against these legislative changes to the judiciary. They succeeded in one instance, they failed in another. But the point is, they were actively soliciting against these legislations. And that's a huge problem, because first of all, they don't have the constitutional authority to do so. And second of all, the law, as I just read to you, prohibits them from ever being involved in cases in which their opinions that have been expressed about legislation before it was formed. So the fact that every judge in the state has been communicating with Mike McGrath and his office and the court as a whole on the discussion of working against these legislative intentions and purposes, and actually proffering lobbyists into the state legislature to lobby against these, pretty much disqualifies every single judge in the state. It takes the judges in the state and says, you've all been part of this discussion, you've all been part of this issue, you've all been lobbying against this, and therefore you cannot preside if this law ever gets called up to question. You can't, you've lobbied against it. But once again, this is also prohibited by the state constitution, which I'll get into in a little while. But the whole point is, it's just bad government. It really is. Mike McGrath he's a power-hungry tyrant who just believes he's in absolute control. And you're going to see through his own words as I'm going through this podcast tonight exactly what I'm talking about. But McGrath's own email that was brought up to this committee's attention was found to discuss reforming the Judicial Standards Commission. The original thing that brought the attention wasn't this issue, but an email that was discovered during the course of this investigation involved McGrath specifically talking about a bill that was designed to reform the Judiciary Standards Commission. It was called HB 685, and would have changed the Judicial Standards Commission entirely. This was found in the email chain. It was criticizing the bill. It was polling other judges for their opinions, trying to draw support to oppose the bill. The Chief Justice, several district court judges, the court administrator, for sure, who knows who else was involved, without actually reading the emails. But a significant, apparently this was an email chain reported that was pretty much every single district court judge in the state, and presumably every Supreme Court justice as well. Primarily, these are emails the Supreme Court does not want to be seen. When the legislature tried to subpoena these records, the court administrator claimed it. And I'll talk about Beth McLaughlin here before I end this episode. But basically, Beth McLaughlin, the court administrator, claimed it deleted them. The legislature tried to subpoena them, and the Montana Supreme Court blocked the subpoenas against themselves. Again, huge issue. But in the course of investigating this issue, they also learned that they've been lobbying against other bills, including the reformation of the Judiciary Standards Commission. So, House Bill 685 would have made the Judicial Standards Commission a supermajority of politically appointed private citizens. It would remove power from the judges. As it currently stands, as I recited in the last podcast, the Judicial Standards Commission in Montana is a 5-person body. It has 2 district court judges who act as co-chair of the commission, a lawyer, and then 2 private persons appointed by the governor. The 3 legal professionals are all individuals who the Supreme Court has control over. Technically, the way the appointments go is the district court judges are elected by their constituents. In other words, other district court judges come together and vote upon 2 people to sit on this board. Then they have to be ratified by the head Supreme Court justice, the Chief Justice, Mike McGrath. And if he doesn't ratify them, he has to go right back to the process. They have to keep electing until Mike McGrath is happy and he's willing to sign off and ratify who's on this panel. So he basically controls that. Then the lawyer is also appointed by the head Supreme Court justice. So he basically has control over 3/5, 60% of this board. Legal professionals, as I've often said, do not police themselves. When they are left to police, the only authority left to police themselves. I keep using the analogy over and over again. You cannot hire a fox to guard against other foxes who are eating the chickens. If the foxes are eating the chickens, the fox you hire is going to simply sit back and let the other foxes do whatever they're going to do. In fact, he's probably going to join in and eat the chickens himself. And this is what's happening here. You cannot ask a majority legal body to oversee legal authorities and not expect some kind of a conflict of interest. In every other state, I could find an example of the Commission on Practice and everyone I reviewed, and I actually detailed the example quite deliberately in the last podcast. Go back and take a look if you want the details back. I'm going to try to avoid going into that. But basically, the majority, everyone I found out there, that I found that was structured in online, they're the majority citizen-based, with legal professionals as advisory minorities. In some cases, they are pretty close to an even. 13 to, 13, 7 of them might be citizens, and 6 of them might be legal professionals. Others, much more so. But they always lean towards non-judiciary officers, non-legal professionals actually being the majority of the board. Montana's just the opposite. Montana flips the scales. The legal people are decide for legal. Those people are there for the show. Those people will never have a majority on this board. So you have a situation, a circumstance, where you have a clearly biased oversight board that's supposed to be overseeing the misconduct of other judicial officials. You're never going to get anywhere. You're certainly not going to get anything accomplished. A vast majority of cases, 98%, that are submitted to the Judicial Standards Commission are ignored or simply ruled against. They don't act on them because they don't want to. And that's a signal coming down from Mike McGrath himself. Remember, Mike McGrath controls 3 of the 5 people who go on this panel. So Mike McGrath believes that judges are above reproach. He will not be universally denies recusals across the state. He will not permit judges to be reviewed, obviously, through the Judicial Standards Commission. So he's making sure that judges are an unapproachable and unimpeachable body. And as you'll find out, he actually believes that the courts are and should be independent of any other government agency. An independent, autonomous agency without oversight, without repercussions, without any kind of restraint. He believes and honestly pushes this agenda that they should be absolutely all-powerful. That's not what our country's about. That's not what the Constitution gives them power to. That's what how Mike McGrath runs his court. And again, I'll leave you those details as we go on. But House Bill 685 would have made a supermajority. It would have given the power to this panel to actually remove judges. And it would have changed the name to the Judicial Inquiry Commission. So that basically the Montana judges would lose all power over keeping themselves in power. Big surprise, Mike McGrath had a problem with this. He lobbied against it significantly. We managed to get the bill struck down. In the last episode, I talked about a petition that was being, and I highly recommend you go back to my last podcast and look at the petition's address. Go there, sign it, endorse it. I endorsed it. I believe in the principles what we're trying to achieve, and I think we should back them and support them. But the Montana Judges Association and State Bar lobbied to kill this bill and succeeded. It failed 47 to 52. Not only did they lobby from their offices using the state servers, they lobbied in the actual legislature. They sent representatives of the Montana Judges Association and representatives of the Montana State Bar to the legislature to lobby against these bills. And they succeeded with House Bill 685. To be clear, this is not within the power of any Montana court, much less the Montana Supreme Court. And to prove that, I'm going to read you the Constitution. These are the constitutional powers of the Montana Supreme Court. Okay? Supreme Court jurisdiction. The Supreme Court has appellate jurisdiction and may issue, hear, and determine writs appropriate thereto. It has original jurisdiction to issue, hear, and determine writs of habeas corpus and such other writs as may be provided by law. It has general supervisory control over all other courts. It may make rules governing appellate procedure, practice, and procedure for all other courts, admission to the bar, and the conduct of its members. Rules of procedure shall be subject to disapproval by the legislature in either of the 2 sessions following promulgation. Supreme Court process shall extend to all parts of the state. That's the entire Supreme Court power. Do you see anywhere, did you hear anywhere, then that it gave Supreme Court power to influence legislation, to lobby for or against legislation, to have any power over the legislature, over any laws that are being considered? Of course not. It's not there. It doesn't exist. The power is not part of the court system. It's called legislating from the bench, by the way, and it's an unconstitutional parameter. Courts cannot legislate. We have a 3-tier structure for making laws. Congress or legislature, depending upon what level it's federal or state, they pass the laws. They consider them, they decide on them, they word them, and they pass them. The executive branch, regardless of the president or governor, regardless of being federal or state, will then sign it into law. If the head of state, the head of the executive branch says, I don't want to, it has to go back to the appropriate legislative body, whether it be Congress or state legislature, who then have to overturn it by a vote of 2 to 3, or 2/3, sorry, a vote of 2/3, to get a supermajority to actually overturn it and make it law. That's the way it works. Then the courts come in, and they can decide whether a law is constitutional, or interpret the language of the law into what it believes the law should be. The court's power over law and legislation is all post. Nothing is pre. They don't get to go in beforehand and influence legislation. That's not how the Constitution gives them power. They are supposed to be part of a co-equal branch of government, where they have three individual branches: the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. Co-equal, all the powers and influences over each other. McGrath, on the other hand, believes that the judiciary is independent, which means he doesn't think it's co-equal, he thinks it's all-powerful. He thinks the court should be allowed to rule and control the other branches of government, but they should have absolutely no power over his. Ladies and gentlemen, that's a tyranny. That's a monarchy. That's not a democracy. And I'll explain why in a little bit. But basically the gist here is that McGrath honestly believes that he has the power to influence legislation, to do whatever he wants, and then not have any oversight. Doesn't sound exactly democratic, does it? Oh, of course not. In the email that got McGrath caught up, the one that actually got called upon before the committee to talk about, he actually claimed that giving citizens oversight would kill democracy. And just for the record, this is where my video cut off last time. I was talking about this, how absolutely ridiculous this is. Of course, citizen oversight is necessary for democracy. That's the whole core of democracy. To be crystal clear, we live in a liberal democracy. Okay? Democracy is defined as by the people, for the people. Or, in other words, power is vested in the people, or, by a better term, the citizens of the country. Democracy pivots on oversight of government officials. To say citizen oversight would kill democracy is ludicrous, because democracy is citizen oversight. It is citizen involvement. It is citizens holding government officials accountable. You have to have it. This is the rhetoric of a tyrant. People don't get to tell me how to be. It'll kill my form of government. He wants to call it democracy. His form of government isn't democracy. His form of government is tyranny. And believe me, Mike McGrath is a tyrant. Throughout the meeting with this committee, several times, he kept calling for an independent judiciary. He believes the judiciary is independent. He thinks that the fact that it is independent somehow makes it the model of defending all democracy. No, absolutely not. An independent branch, regardless of the executive branch, legislative branch, or judiciary, means that branch is control of government. It controls all of government. It's no longer a co-equal branch of government. It's no longer an equal branch. It's no longer separation of powers. That branch can do anything and everything it wants to because it has no oversight, it has no limitations or restrictions, and it has absolute power over the other branches. Co-equality is gone. There is no such thing as an independent judicial branch in American democracy. There can't be. Because if you have one branch being independent, you no longer have co-equal branches of government. The Constitution, both the state and the federal, every state constitution in the United States calls for co-equal branches of government. No branch is independent of another branch. No branch is independent, period. An independent judiciary means it's one free of any restraint or oversight. Under McGrath's scheme, judiciary will control all the branches. In other words, McGrath is calling for a monarchy run by the courts, of which he is head of state, because he's the chief justice, which means he's the head judge of the state, the highest judge in the highest court of the state. And if the courts run the state, that makes him the head of state. By default, by de facto. Because if he's in control of all the courts, he's in control, and the courts are in control of all the other branches of government, That makes him the tyrant. It makes him the monarch. At the very least, you could argue that the Montana Supreme Court would represent that tyranny, that monarchy. But, nevertheless, Mike McGrath thinks he is. He genuinely believes he's entitled to this elite status, being completely independent. He doesn't believe he should have to answer to anybody. He showed up at this meeting, I don't know what he expected to accomplish, by telling everybody that he's independent, that the legislature shouldn't be trying to take its independence away from him. McGrath defended his lobbying at this meeting. He said he claimed he had an obligation to voice opinion of the law affecting the judiciary. No, he has no obligation. He has no duty. He has no power. I just read the Constitution to you. I just read the Constitution. I guarantee you the legislature has not given him the power to control them unilaterally. It's not given them the power to assert their constitutional authority to write and pass laws, to influence legislation. I guarantee you. In fact, I just read a statute passed by the Montana State Legislature that says that a judge can't even preside over a case if he gets involved with it, in the law, before it's passed. They can't even be involved with it. And McGrath sent a chain out to every district court judge in the state. Every judge seated in the state of Montana has become part of this. And therefore, by state law, the intent of the legislature is that judges shouldn't be doing this because they now cannot preside over a law in which they have any effect over. So, do you honestly believe me? I looked. There's nothing. If anybody is watching this and they can find a law in the state of Montana that gives the Montana Supreme Court this power, by all means, share it with me. I have not been able to find it. It doesn't exist. The legislature is not going to give unconstitutional power to the state Supreme Court. Mike McGrath has usurped it. Mike McGrath has taken it upon himself to take this power for himself and claim he has an obligation to it, a duty to it. He doesn't. No one does. Nobody has the power to take the power of another branch of government. No one does. Simply put, power McGrath took for himself is all it is. It's not power granted by the Constitution. It's not power granted by the state legislature. It's power he took for himself. And he actually, in his own words, ladies and gentlemen, in his own words, he says, that bill, talking about the House bill, gave citizens the authority to actually remove an elected official from office. It didn't require any kind of due process. It didn't require any kind of standard. It just meant that if there was a mob that was mad about something that a judge did, we could remove the judge from office, even though that judge is elected by the people. And yes, that is the first step in the demise of the democratic system. Excuse me? If the people rise up and say, we do not want this judge in power, they have the right to remove him. That's not the downfall of the democratic system. That is the power of a democratic system. That is something tyrants fear. And remember, this our legislature that does have the power to impeach, by the way, through the Constitution, only meets for 3 months out of 24. Unless there's a special session called, they only meet for 3 months out of 24. And in that time, they have to pass 2 years worth of legislation. Their time is taken up in trying to get bills passed, legislature passed, to keep funding going for the state of Montana. They're far too busy to be involved in a committee deciding whether or not they're going to impeach somebody. And McGrath knows this. He knows this. You have a citizen legislature that is not going to spend 2 years trying to investigate. I mean, look how long we just saw impeachment, 2 impeachments in as many years against the former President Trump. It took massive commitment, years of investigation, to get to the point they were prepared to bring up a first impeachment against President Trump. The second was only brought against him in a rush because he was getting out of office and they wanted to try to bar him from seeking re-election. But the whole point is, it takes a long time to investigate impeaching a single judge. Now try thinking about how to address multiple judges who might or might not be in need of impeachment. We have an ineffective system set up for that under the impeachment requirements in the state of Montana. And they know this. McGrath knows this. All the judges know this. Why do you think the judges act with such impunity? They have a Judicial Standards Commission that, in theory, is supposed to be able to punish them and remove them from office, but does not. But basically, McGrath doesn't want to give that power to anybody else. By sitting here and saying that this body could do all this, to take, so could the Judicial Standards Commission. The Judicial Standards Commission could remove a judge from office. It has that power. It never uses it. It has that power. So, if the Judicial Standards Commission has this power, and it's somehow not the downfall of democracy, how does giving this power to the citizens now make it the downfall of democracy? It doesn't. If this power alone caused the downfall of democracy, it wouldn't matter who wielded it. What McGrath is saying is that he alone deserves to control this power. He alone has the ability to make this determination, because if you don't let him use it, it's going to cause the downfall of democracy. This is all fear-mongering. This is all saying, you're going to suffer, the whole world's going to collapse if you don't let me use it my way. It's a tyrant's fear. A tyrant fears the people. And that's the biggest problem here, is that Mike McGrath is a tyrant who thinks he's entitled to running the entire state government of Montana. Of course, it requires due process and standards. Of course, the law required, but the law that was being passed put a standard and a process in place. That's due process. Standards, those are the laws in which the committee is organized. They existed. The law set them in place. It just didn't give McGrath the power anymore. That's what it was. It didn't give McGrath the power. It didn't give his little cadre power the ability to keep his judges safe. And yes, the people have the right to be upset with a judge. The people have the right to call for his or her removal. And McGrath should not be able to decide through his own influence whether that happens. McGrath also insisted that the proper way to remove elected officials was to vote for or against them in an election. Now keep in mind, judicial officers, just the Supreme Court, they went for 8 years. They have 8-year term. So you have to wait. If they get into the seat and they decide to shoot somebody from the bench, just get up and take a hot shot and shoot somebody and you say, I didn't kill him, no problem. You got to wait 8 years to vote him out? Come on. I just mentioned we do have impeachment rules, but we have an ineffective legislature to do that. The Judicial Standards Commission is supposed to exist to be able to remove judges who are incapable of performing ethical conduct or simply do not have the moral core to be properly judges. And a judge sitting there and shooting somebody in the leg certainly qualifies. So what happens if Mr. McGrath or Judge Rice or one of the other 5 justices on our 7-judge Supreme Court get up and decide to take a baseball bat and slug somebody in the back of the head? Can we remove them? Now, according to McGrath, we've got to wait till the rest of his term and let the people decide. Kind of ignores the fact that no one ever runs against the incumbents in Montana. And I've pointed this out before. When an incumbent runs, you do not have anyone run against them. The abusive nature of judges in Montana is such that no one dares. And again, this is because the Judicial Standards Commission doesn't remove these judges. If you want to run against a judge, you have to appear in that judge's court because you have to be within the realm of which this judge operates. You have to be within his county. You have to be able to practice within his court. You have to be able to go in front of him. And you go before a judge who you're running against, or against one of his friends, you're going to get blacklisted. It's political suicide to run against a judge because they can exercise this kind of abusive conduct, this kind of abusive behavior. And the Judicial Standards Commission will not hold them in check. They will not recuse them. They will not admonish them. They will not remove them from office really going to affect it. Judicial practice, but it's nevertheless how it works in Montana. So you never have anyone run against an incumbent. The next time we had our election over, I did this before. I've done it on my blog, the monspiracy.wordpress.com. I've posted all over the internet. I posted examples where I take pictures of the ballot and I show the incumbents don't have, in the court system, do not have to go in against them. They don't, because it's political suicide to do so. It's an accepted practice in Montana that once somebody is in office, they stay in office until they choose to leave. Or they're simply medically incapable of continuing. I.e., they have a stroke, they die, something. So, McGrath's idea that somehow we leave it up to the electorate. If McGrath, for instance, is the only person on the ballot, how do you vote him out? There's no one else to vote for. You can have a whole bunch of write-in ballots, and I've oftentimes told people, hey, if you want to protest, write my name on the ballot. I can't legally serve office because I'm a political prisoner in Montana. I'm under the custody of the state of Montana. I can't hold an office. So putting my name in there doesn't give me an office. What it'll do is demonstrate a unified protest, perhaps, but it won't put me in office. And I couldn't serve a judicial position anyway because I'm a lawyer. Again, you have to be a lawyer to be a judge in Montana. Therefore, I couldn't serve regardless. But if McGrath is the only person on the ballot, and people simply withhold votes from him, he still has enough cronies who stand behind him and his own vote to vote himself in. I voted myself into a position in Polson several years ago. When I lived out in Polson, like 96, 97, 98, somewhere in that range, I always go to the ballot, and if I see somebody who's either running unopposed, or I see somebody there's simply nobody who's running for the seat, I will put my own name in the protest vote because I think it's absolutely counterproductive to the democratic process to not have legitimate contests for individual office. Again, I'm apolitical. But I actually voted myself into a Democratic committee seat by doing this because I protested by writing my name in a position where nobody was running for the seat. And the way it works, unfortunately, in Montana, as it does with many states, in order to vote in the primary election, which there's a lot of ballot issues that come in the primary election that don't show up in the main election. In the primary election, you have to select either a Democrat or a Republican ticket. That year I selected a Democratic ticket because it just happened to be Democratic. Okay, I'll get the Democratic ticket. I voted both, I don't care. All I'm doing is wanting to vote without the ballot issues. And I protest anybody who is running out uncontested or doesn't have to run for the seat. Consequently, I voted myself in. One vote. One vote. Nobody else voted for the position, everyone else left it blank. I voted myself into office. Sadly, I turned down the office. Why? I mean, I received a letter that said, you received the most write-in votes for this position, do you accept? I thought about it for a couple of weeks before I made my decision. And my decision was, I don't want to be affiliated with the Democratic Party. I wouldn't have wanted to be affiliated with the Republican Party or any party. I'm apolitical. So I turned down the position. But nevertheless, I voted myself in with one vote. If everybody in the state chose not to vote for McGrath and leave that blank, McGrath would vote himself into office. Simple truth, ladies and gentlemen. That's just the simple truth of the fact. There's only one vote, that's all it takes. One vote to vote him in office. And there's no one running against him? How do you possibly vote him out of office? So his solution to voting that the only way to remove an elected official from office is to leave it up to the electorate. Give the electorate a choice first. If you're not giving them a choice, that's not an option. The legislature is not an option. The Judicial Standards Commission, as it currently runs, protects and shelters the judges. It's not an option. So how do we remove corrupt officials? How do we remove corrupt judges? We don't do it in the current system. We do it with the new laws. That's the law that was trying to be passed that McGrath opposed. That's what he did when he organized his lobbying efforts against it. Even Supreme Court justices have no opponents on the ballot. So how can he speak to the right way? How can this be considered any way to solve the problem? It leaves a tyrannical system in power. If no power exists to remove an abusive judge, no one runs against them, there's no power to remove him or her, the legislature only meets 3 months a year, every other year, how can they properly impeach them? How can they properly remove anybody from office? They stay in office for life. And McGrath is aware of this when he proposes this. He knows no one runs against him. He knows no one is. Of course he knows this. He knows he doesn't have any opponents. He knows none of the judges in office actually have opponents running against them. There must be a method to remove and to make judges accountable. There must be. But McGrath believes judges are above the law. McGrath actually said that in so many words. And this is a quote directly from him, again, at this meeting. He says, if you look around, my argument would be that actually the independent court system, remember I said, he keeps using that term, the independent court system, that is the linchpin of our economy. It's the linchpin of our society in terms of stability. And it's extremely well designed and thought out for that reason. The Judicial Standards Commission is one of the main institutions in Montana that are designed to make sure that the judiciary is fair and impartial. In other words, McGrath wants to take credit for the economy, the stability of all society, and somehow that the Judicial Standards Commission keeps things fair and impartial, all because the court system is independent. Then again, the court system is not independent. And the court is not responsible for the economy, society, or even grandma's apple pie. Okay? McGrath is actually trying to run the fear factor here. He's fear-mongering. He's actually threatening the very things he claims responsibility for. The insinuation is that if anybody interferes and yanks away his power, all society, all the economy, everything's going to collapse. You've got to leave the Judicial Standards Commission in place because it will hold everything together. He actually says that the independent court system is the linchpin of our society. No, it's the linchpin of your political power, your head of state tyrannical monarchy. That's what it's the linchpin of. It's not the linchpin of any kind of actual fair or just society, much less a fair and just court system, because judges are above reproach. They cannot be challenged. They cannot be removed from authority. They cannot be removed from office. They can have no consequences against them, and they can abuse anybody who tries to run against them. They can sabotage the political careers of anybody they want to, just for the sake of a grudge. This is not even remotely a true statement by McGrath. It's all fear-mongering. It's all propaganda. Remember, I've done so much talking about propaganda. I can watch my podcast on propaganda. This is a perfect example of it. None of this defends its efforts to influence legislation either. None of this says, this is okay, this is why I did it, and this makes it all right. No. An independent judiciary is not something that should exist or even does exist on the law, but it does exist in Montana because no one is stopping McGrath. No one exists to hold McGrath accountable. The Judicial Standards Commission works for McGrath. McGrath appoints 3 of the 5 people on the panel. McGrath is the one who's in charge of all of it. You think they're ever going to remove McGrath? McGrath put them where they are. McGrath chose people who are yes men to his political idealism, which is that the courts are above reproach, the courts can't be recused, the courts can't be challenged, or there's no oversight. And fates preserve whoever tried to put citizens in charge because it's going to kill democracy. Citizens are in control. That's what makes it a democracy. That's what makes it a democracy. And you can't sit here and say you honestly believe this because he knows this is not true. I will say a lot of bad things about McGrath. I will say he has no morals. I'll say he has no ethics. He constantly violates the standards of conflict of interest. He practices this matter of I'm going to rule against whoever I don't like, I don't like them. totally throws its power away. It's trying to take over the state, or he thinks he has taken over the state, and he's basically trying to convince everybody that it's the right thing. Come along with me because I'm responsible for the economy. I'm responsible for social existence. The whole idea that we're stable and good and kind and the society had to collapse into absolute chaos. All I'm taking credit for it. It's my independent judiciary. I'm responsible. I'm the one who's making it all possible. No. If there is a core to the Great Montana Conspiracy, it starts and stops with the court systems. Then it extends into the prosecutors and the governors, but it starts and it comes right back in around to the courts. The courts start it, they may run off to the executive branch for a little while, they run off to the legislative branch for a little while, but it always comes back to the courts. Because that's how McGrath has got set up, and that's how, and actually, we actually have a legislature and a group of people in the legislature who are actually starting to see this. We're actually getting legislators who actually seem to care that there's a problem in how this court system is running. And they're trying to affect change. And guess what? The Montana Supreme Court and Mike McGrath and every district court judge in the state of Montana are participating in efforts to lobby against those changes. See a problem with it, ladies and gentlemen? I certainly do. McGrath is trying to, in this case, assume power over the legislative branch. He wants to comment on and influence legislation. Nowhere does that power exist for a court or a judge. He has no obligation, no duty, and certainly no power. But he believes he does, because he believes he runs the state. And sadly, if his viewpoint is not challenged, he does. It's called consent by absentia. If you don't argue against him, if you don't challenge him, if you don't take that power away from him by force, you give him the consent to be that way and act that way with impunity. That's consent by absentia. Simply being absent of complaint, you are giving consent. You must make complaints against this. You must stand up to this, because if you don't, that's why people let this exist. If you sit back and say, I don't want to fight, I don't want to deal with it, then they win. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is good men do nothing. That's Edmund Burke. Or Edinburgh, sorry, Edinburgh. I may be wrong. I think it's Edinburgh. But regardless, the quote is valid. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Mike McGrath is the epitome of evil. He is a man who believes that he is in charge of the entire state of Montana, that his judiciary is independent of any oversight, it is independent of any legislative reform, it is independent of any rules, any laws, any boundaries, any structures. He has the power to assert the power of other branches freely without consequence. He has the power to do whatever he wants with his own power and influence. And most importantly, judicial officers are above accountability. Unless they don't ally with McGrath's agenda. His powers are set in the state constitution. The state constitution gives the court powers. It gives the power to the legislature to amend and to set those boundaries, and the legislature is not given him these powers. Absent any state legislative authority or amendment to the Constitution, they don't exist. In a nutshell, McGrath's justification was that he has power because the law didn't specifically tell him he didn't have it. If I want the power to fly, does that mean I can fly? There's no law that says I can't. There's no law that says Ron Glick cannot fly. So Ron Glick, I'm going to go fly, ladies and gentlemen. It doesn't work that way. So the absence of saying you don't have a power, saying you have a power, or an absence of power saying you don't have it, doesn't mean you have it. I don't have the power to walk outside and just shoot a gun at the side of my building over and over and over and over and over again, regardless if I can shoot it through. Of course not. There's no law that specifically says I can't do that, but it does encapsulate into public endangerment, encapsulates into areas where I shouldn't be doing it, especially if it causes harm to someone else. We have laws and structures in our society for a reason. In this case, we have laws and boundaries and restrictions on the courts. So the courts cannot be independent. That's why those limitations exist. And let's be clear. What he's doing is forbidden. It's not, he's saying it doesn't exist. It absolutely exists. What he's doing is forbidden by the state constitution. And to prove it, let me read it. Section 1, separation of powers. The power of the government of this state is divided into 3 distinct branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. No person or persons charged with the exercise of power properly belonging to one branch shall exercise any power properly belonging to either of the others, except as in this Constitution expressly directed or permitted. In other words, the judicial branch cannot use or act upon the powers of the legislature. Bottom line, the legislature can't become judges, the judges cannot become legislators. Nor can the judge go sit in the governor's chair. It doesn't work that way. When you have a co-equal branch of government, there's checks and balances. All the branches have checks on each other to keep one branch from becoming independent, or becoming all-powerful, becoming a monarchy or a tyranny. Mike McGrath runs his own little tyranny because everyone just sitting back and letting them do it. Since the 1970s, they've been letting the state Supreme Court gain more and more power. Mike McGrath has just figured out how to wield the weapon. I've spoken before about the power of lawyers in government. In effect, they represent a secret cadre running our government. They consist 1/3 automatically of one branch of government, 1/3. Judges must be lawyers. Therefore, you have 1/3 of the government automatically lawyers. They're staffed by lawyers. They're run by everything's done in court. They have all clerks. They have paralegals. They have their lawyers. They're all run by the legal department. They're all lawyers. Then you have the fact that these lawyers are not in any way prohibited from being other branches of government. The vast majority of legislators are lawyers. They're people who understand the laws and want to effect change in the laws and therefore run for office. And then you have other examples where lawyers actually get into the governor's seat. Prior to Mr. Gianforte, who's our current governor, we had a lawyer. We had a lawyer who was our governor. Okay? So we have lawyers who take governance, but even if you don't have a governor who's a lawyer, practicing lawyer, okay? Their entire staff comprises of lawyers. You have lawyers in the various executive branch offices. You have the Attorney General, who's a lawyer. You have the Department of Corrections, often run by lawyers. You have lawyers staffed every angle and position within government and the executive branch. So you have nothing but lawyers who dominate and predominate throughout our government. And they represent a large influential group that influence and affect government. And here you have a group consisting of 1/3 of the government who are basically trying to mount a coup against the other 2 branches. There's no basically about what Mike McGrath thinks he's doing. He's calling for the independent. He's actually trying to say that the Montana state courts are independent. He thinks he's already won the coup. And now he's trying to prevent the legislature from changing that. But keep in mind, even if the legislature does change it, he has the power to turn around and declare the laws unconstitutional. That's what the courts allow. The court's power is. They can declare laws unconstitutional. So even if the state legislature passes a reformation of the Judicial Standards Commission, all it has to do is go in front of Mike McGrath's court, and Mike McGrath says unconstitutional, and it's thrown out. No oversight, ladies and gentlemen. That's the problem. No oversight. McGrath is calling for judiciary independence of any oversight, any kind of standards. I mean, Judicial Standards Commission is run by a majority of legal professionals, which the Montana Supreme Court controls. Supreme Court has absorbed both the state bar and approval of attorneys under their banner. So they get to decide who's even an attorney in the state of Montana. They have an absolute control of who could or could not be a judge until actually I think it takes effect in July of this year. But until last year, the law said very clearly the Supreme Court would have to decide whose name was on the list of judges to consider. Now they've managed to stave off an attempt to have direct oversight of judges. They also, by the way, quashed a bill that would have made the justices in Montana appointed by districts rather than the whole statewide. So you actually had individual districts. It's like you have representatives in our legislature. So that you have, say, the upper fourth or upper sixth of the state be Judge 1, the lower sixth be Judge 2, the central lower be Judge 3, the upper middle be Judge 4, the upper eastern block be Judge 5, the lower eastern block be Judge 6, and then they would all come together, these judges would come together and decide who to appoint for the Chief Justice. Big surprise, Montana Supreme Court didn't want to do that. That law is now actually up it's on a ballot coming up in 2023 this year, or 2022 this year, sorry. It's coming up in November. It's actually on a ballot. I'm voting for it, just for the record. It would destroy Mike McGrath's power base. It would absolutely obliterate it. Because he couldn't basically continue to be the state Supreme Chief Justice, because the 6 justices who comprise the other parts of the court would actually decide who the Chief Justice was. They would have to petition and lobby within their own districts. They wouldn't be able to do statewide. It'd be a better representation of our citizenship if issues are affecting the central north district of Montana. Then you have a judge from that district who better understood it. It just makes practical sense. But it would destroy Mike McGrath's power base, so obviously he lobbied against it and successfully quashed it. But it is on the ballot. Go vote for it. Highly endorse it. But like I said, keep it right. Individual drug oversight, even with the Judicial Standards Commission reform, is not the same as court oversight. And I point that out because, especially with the Montana Supreme Court, court is a body of several, not one. The individual counties most of them don't have a single judge. They have multiple judges, which means they all tend to share an ideal, the camaraderie. They stand together. In our district, we have 4. We're going to get a 5th one, actually. Believe it or not, we're going to get a 5th judge. So we're actually going to have 5 judges in our district, in our area. If one of them is attacked, the other 4 are going to conglomerate around that judge and try to make sure that judge is defended. So you'd actually have to attack the entire court system that exists in Fayette County to have any effect. Attacking one judge does nothing. You must be able to attack a court system. But Judicial Standards Commission reform is a start. And it's a way to actually publicize and make public these judicial standard records, because right now we can't even do what those are. They're all under confidential seal. In this instance, McGrath sought to abuse his position as the Chief Justice to usurp another branch's power, because he genuinely believes the judiciary should be independent. Not because he thinks it actually serves the public good, but because it feeds his own power. It feeds his absolute control, his ego. Power to rule over other branches, even assert their powers, is unconstitutional. I read the section to you. You know what I'm talking about. But he doesn't want any accountability of the judiciary to any branch. He wants to be able to decide over any of those branches, to basically tell those branches what to do, to even take their powers at leisure whenever he wants to. Don't you dare tell the judges what they can do. They are above the law. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the definition of a tyranny. A government in power of a single person or group with harsh, cruel, and unfair control of the people. What do we call what we've got right now? What have I just described? McGrath's claim that the court should be independent de facto puts him as head of state. McGrath is the Chief Justice of the highest court in the state. And if he keeps insisting the courts are independent, what does that say about him? If the courts are independent, not subject to oversight or review, not subject to supervision or changing their policies or how they operate or anything else, but they have the power to take the authority of the other branches at leisure, what does that say? They're in control. They control all of government. They don't have to answer to the rest of the parts of government. They don't have to answer the people because once they're in office, they don't have anyone against them. They don't have an oversight of any kind, even from the Judicial Standards Commission, because the Judicial Standards Commission works for the court. And if they are the ones who are absolute power, and the Chief Justice is the head of them all, that puts Mike McGrath as head of state. He's not governor. He was not elected for that position, but he's taken it for himself. And no one's stopping it. Nobody's telling him he can't do it. He's literally saying, I'm responsible for everything. If you can try to take me down, all society's going to collapse. The economy's going to collapse. Everything's going to collapse. You need to leave the Judicial Standards Commission alone because that guarantees this is all going to stay in place. I'm part of the independent court system, and I'm the head of that independent court system. That makes me head of the court system. And if the court system's head of the state, that makes him the leader of the state. De facto. Logic. It's not the way it's supposed to work. It's the way he has it work, and nobody's really standing up to him. The legislature is trying to push for change. And I can only hope they succeed, because it's necessary. Because if you don't, you're basically giving him unilateral control of the state. And this brings up the original reason of all this dialogue, because there's a little bit of an update. Montana legislature learned McGrath, Montana Supreme Court Administrator Beth McLaughlin, and others, district court judges around the state, were lobbying against a bill to take away power to restrict who appointed absentee district court judges in an election. If the judge left office, he died, he got too sick, he resigned, whatever. He'll leave a vacancy. Under the old law, there's something called the Judicial Nominations Commission. That, of course, was a branch of the Montana Supreme Court. Big surprise, right? They would vet candidates. They would give a list of candidates to the governor, and the governor had to take a choice from that list to choose who to appoint. There's nothing in the law that says how long that list has to be, which means that it can be a list of one person. The Montana Supreme Court chief got to say, hey, I get to make this list. He gets to ratify it, he gets to sign off on it, and he gets to send it to the governor. He gets to decide basically who sits on the seat and who doesn't. The governor gets to choose from his limited selection, but ultimately the decision about who can and cannot be a judge rests with the Supreme Court. So Gianforte lobbied for and successfully got the law passed that took away that. It took away the Judicial Nominations Commission and gave the power solely to the governor. Now the governor makes his own choices from recommendations his own staff give him, and then submits those for approval to the Senate. It's the way it should have been all along. It's not that all they lobbied against it. This particular law did pass and was signed into law. So it was called Senate Bill 140, by the way. And it gave control from the Supreme Court over who could and could not be seated. So if you have that power being taken away, the legislature is chipping away a little bit of the power of the Montana Supreme Court. McGrath, McLaughlin, district court judges began lobbying against the bill. The legislature found out about it. The legislature found out about this email chain and started asking for emails. Subpoenaed the records from the court administrator, Beth McLaughlin. McLaughlin claimed to have deleted some of the emails, that she couldn't comply because some of the emails were deleted. Now keep in mind, once again, they are forbidden from deleting state records. It's tampering with official records. Official records must be preserved as part of state law. McLaughlin cannot legally delete state emails. She did. She's not going to face consequence, but she did. Tampering with official records, by the way, is a felony. Doing it in the capacity of an official position, in which case she's an elected official. Actually, I'm not sure she's elected, but I have to look that up. As a gentleman, I'm not sure she's elected or she's appointed. I think she's elected. But regardless, she's still an official. And as an official, doing this in her official duty makes an official misconduct, which is another felony. Every time she deleted an email, it's an individual act, an individual choice to commit a crime. And it's compounded because she does it in her official duty. So every email she deleted, she's got 2 compounded felonies. So for however many emails she actually deleted, she could have 1,000 compounded felonies. She's never going to face a charge for it. The legislature, on the other hand, said, okay, we're going to be smart. We're going to go to the IT department or the executive branch and ask them for the records. Because guess what? They're doing their job. They're preserving the records. So they comply. They give the emails over to the legislature. So Montana Supreme Court finds out about it on a Sunday. This is how desperate the Montana Supreme Court was to stop this. On a Sunday, they issued an order quashing those subpoenas, said it did not serve any legitimate legislative purpose. It was beyond the power and scope of the legislature to oversee the Montana Supreme Court's emails, and ordered them returned. That matter, by the way, has been appealed, or actually applied through a writ of certiorari, to the United States Supreme Court. The Montana Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court has not decided whether they're taking the case up. But they did call for McLaughlin to file a response. McLaughlin filed a response this last week. Of course, she calls for dismissal. But she actually claims in her papers the United States Supreme Court does not have the authority. She tries to argue this is all about state laws and how the U.S. Supreme Court doesn't have the authority to oversee this. In fact, her actual quote is, and I'm going to substitute Montana legislature for petitioners and this court for the United States Supreme Court, just to make it clearer. But the quote is, if Montana legislature is correct, there is no limit in the United States Supreme Court's jurisdiction to hear and decide issues of state law, particularly issues touching sensitive state interbranch political questions. Actually, this is the core of certiorari review. I have to wonder whether the person who wrote this brief even understands what a certiorari is. Writ of certiorari is a method by which the United States Supreme Court can overrule or review the decision of the highest court in an individual state. It can't review a district court decision or an appellate court decision, but on a final order, when there are no other appellate remedies available within the state, you can submit for a writ of certiorari or a writ of review to the United States Supreme Court to review the highest court's decision. In this case, there is no higher court in Montana other than the Montana Supreme Court, and therefore their decision to quash these subpoenas was a final order that had no appellate right and no appellate capacity remaining within the state of Montana. It absolutely was subject to a certiorari review. That is the purpose of a certiorari review. That is the purpose of it. Of course the United States Supreme Court has reviewed the highest state court ruling. It's just preposterous that they don't. She tried to mask it behind trying to talk about whether it was a state law issue. We're talking about state law here. No. You're talking about the interpretation of the Montana Supreme Court to quash subpoenas issued by the state legislature. It was an act of the Montana Supreme Court. There are no appellate remedies remaining within the state where the certiorari is appropriate. The legislature is not calling upon the United States Supreme Court to rule upon a law without first bringing it to the Montana Supreme Court. That's not what they're doing, though. That's what Beth McGrath wants them to think of. It's all smoke and mirrors. Pay attention to this issue. This is the issue. We're talking about state law. No, we're not talking about state law. We're talking about the Montana Supreme Court issuing an order that was so desperate to get out they issued it on a Sunday. Unanimously, by the way, all 7 justices signed on to it on a Sunday. That's how desperate they were to quash. They couldn't even wait till Monday morning. They had to do it Sunday. They did not want any further compliance, any further cooperation with the state legislature. They wanted to stop it in its tracks. It absolutely did. And it did so by issuing the order on a Sunday. The United States Supreme Court is not being asked to judge state law here. It is being asked to review whether the Montana Supreme Court acted within constitutional boundaries. And it is absolutely the purview of the United States Supreme Court in a certiorari review. This is not a question of whether a law exists. This is a question of a court decision. It's a final court decision in the state of Montana. And this instance is a question of whether the Montana Supreme Court has authority. Could it rule on issues that affected itself? No man should be a judge of his own actions. Could they rule and issue a subpoena quashing an action was against their own records? Could they suppress a subpoena against themselves? Could they obstruct oversight of themselves? And they did it to record order which is subject to certiorari review. Obviously, McGrath thinks that the courts are above recusal. He said it 100 times, he said it once. He believes courts are independent. He believes they can interfere in a certain other branch of powers. He believes courts can make rulings blocking oversight. Is any surprise his court administrators echo the same line? I'll say it again. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. And right now, the United States Supreme Court has a chance to decide whether corruption in Montana will be challenged. Keep in mind, the United States Supreme Court reviews between 100 and 150 cases every year, out of the 7,000 plus that get submitted to it. So will they take this case up or not? Will they decide on it? They tend to grant priority to state motions and state applications, just like they tend to grant authority or preference to executive branch inquiries or congressional inquiries. They tend to grant priority to actual other government agencies. So there's a pretty good chance this is going to get up there in the state of possibly being reviewed. And I hope they do. If they do not, McGrath will undisputably be in control of the state. Because he will just strike down any law Montana legislature makes to take away his power. If he can continue to rule against things that affect him, and if he rules on this law or in any manner, shape, or form that he has lobbied against, he's in violation of state law. Who holds him accountable? Not the Judicial Standards Commission, not the legislature, because they can't organize themselves enough to bring, in 3 months out of 24, to bring a proper impeachment against the sitting judge on the Supreme Court. I mean, what are they going to do? Where's the power? Where's the rest? And this is the problem we have. Welcome to the Great Montana Conspiracy. This is a core issue. The question is, what are we going to do about it? The best thing to do is to get this information out there. As I always say, if you're watching this video on YouTube, please like and subscribe, share this content on your other social media platforms. Regardless of what platform you're watching it on, please pay attention to the text that's attached to this. If you are watching this video and somehow do not have any text attached to it, please feel free to visit us on our original domain, which is monspiracy.podbean.com, where you can actually guarantee the content will be attached to it. I do always express my concern for everybody's welfare and hope that everyone is being safe out there. And as always, whenever possible, please be free.